So, you may not know this about me, but I'm a huge fan of science fiction and fantasy. If you were to look at my bookshelf, you would find a fairly sizable number of epic fantasy novels from the likes of Ursula K. Le Guin, Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, Stephen Erickson, and others. That being said, you would probably not be surprised to know that I'm also a huge fan of the Song of Ice and Fire series and its television adaptation, Game of Thrones. I think that Westeros, Essos, and the surrounding lands are some of the most captivating, well-realized examples of secondary world building in recent memory. I, like millions of other fans, await the new season coming in April, this month, and the sixth book, The Winds of Winter, which is coming in, well, who knows, whenever Mr. Martin is finished. One of the reasons that I love fantasy is because it allows us to evaluate our world through the lens of imaginary ones. One of the most fascinating things about these books and the TV show is the way they treat religion. Martin has gone out of his way to make sure that Westeros, Essos, and the rest of the world's landmasses are populated with a number of different faiths. On the continent of Westeros, there are three prominent religions. The faith of the Old Gods, practiced almost exclusively in the north of the continent, and originated by the non-human children of the forest, who were, I guess, the indigenous people of the land, then taken up by the first humans that arrived later. Then there's the faith of the Seven, which was introduced by a later migration of people called the Andals. And finally, the faith of the Drowned God, which is practiced in the Iron Islands and a few of the surrounding lands. Yet that is not where Martin's plethora of faiths end. Another religion that is popular in the eastern continent of Essos, and trying to get a foothold in Westeros, is the religion of a god named R'hllor, also called the Lord of Light, also called the Red God. In the books and the show, we are primarily given information about the rituals of this religion through scenes that involve a band of outlaws called the Brotherhood Without Banners and the faction of people who support Stannis Baratheon, a Westerosi general and noble who believes he has the best claim to the throne of Westeros. He, his wife, and many of his followers have converted to the faith due to the influence of a foreign priestess and sorceress called Melisandre, the Red Lady of Ashai. The faith of the Lord of Light stands out from many of the other faiths in the series because its priests actually have demonstrated that they have very real supernatural powers, including resurrection of the dead, birthing shadow demons, and possibly even clairvoyance, among other things. The priests of R'hllor are also set apart from the priests of other religions in that they actually do practice human sacrifice. They believe that their god R'hllor is in an eternal struggle with an evil god known as the Great Other, and that these sacrifices are commanded by their god in order to serve his purposes. Mr. Martin clearly pulled from the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism when he was making this up. Melisandre has told Stannis that he is specially chosen by the one true God to fulfill a great destiny. At several points, she convinces him that human sacrifice is necessary to gain R'hllor's favor for one or more endeavors. Stannis' wife is even more devout than he is, and in the show is seen happily praying to R'hllor to purify the soul of her brother, even as he screams for Melisandre not to burn him alive. In the most recent season of Game of Thrones, one of the biggest twists happened when, spoiler alert for the most recent season, Stannis and his wife Selyse had their only child restrained, bound, and burned alive by Melisandre, when she insisted that it was the will of the Lord of Light that she die. This has not happened in the book series, but there are implications that it just might. Needless to say, fans throughout the world were quite understandably shocked, enraged, and saddened that Stannis, who many had regarded as one of the most honorable and principled characters in the show, had offered his daughter up as a human sacrifice to appease an invisible, inaudible, intangible deity at the request of a sorceress who many regarded, and still regard, as one of the most diabolical characters in the show. Look at the comments online for any review of this episode, and look at the reactions right here on YouTube as people watched the scene unfold. They asked, what kind of person would do this? Much more, what kind of benevolent God would demand such a thing? Well, if you are a practicing Jew, Christian, or Muslim who is strangely a fan of this very violent, very sexual show and book series, then I would say that you have forfeited your right to be outraged, because you believe in and worship a God who would actually ask a faithful servant to offer his child up as a human sacrifice. I am, of course, speaking of Abraham, whose defining act, and the one he is most celebrated for, is his willingness to bind his son and offer him up as a human sacrifice. It's a story that is famously the subject of great paintings, movies, and every year, I can say from experience, it is taught to very small children as an example of faithful obedience and piety in Sunday school flannel graphs. Abraham's obedience and piety is so respected that the three major monotheistic religions are sometimes grouped together and called collectively the Abrahamic faiths. Now I can already hear the counter-arguments that there is a fundamental difference between Abraham being willing to burn his child alive, then stopping short when a goat shows up, and Stannis actually following through on the sacrifice of his daughter to please R'hllor. But I would disagree. I would say that there can't really be a distinction. The point of the story found in Genesis chapter 22 is that Abraham served a God that would ask him to do this, and that Abraham was willing to do it. Let's be honest here, practicing Jews, Christians, and Muslims. If the text had read that Yahweh had not provided the goat, and Abraham actually had killed his son to appease his God, you would likely have some refined, well-oiled apologetics argument that definitely demonstrated to skeptics that Abraham killing his son was actually a good thing. Because, you can always fall back on divine command theory. I have personally had a Christian that I knew tell me that if they heard a voice that they were sufficiently convinced was the voice of Yahweh telling them to kill their child, they would do it because, as they put it, God gave them the child, so of course he can take it away. You followers of the Abrahamic religions, of course, would likely not accept that argument if it were espoused by someone defending the religions of ancient Canaan or Mesoamerica, and I highly suspect that those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones would not accept such an argument from those in Stannis' camp. You might also argue that your God has demonstrated his power when other gods have not. I would question this, but indulge me for a hypothetical scenario. Imagine that you lived in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, and had seen the Red Priest Thoros raise somebody from the dead by praying to R'hllor, or you had seen Melisandre consume poison and remain unaffected. Would you see this as a demonstration of their god's power? Would you have any reason to be skeptical? You might also argue that other religions are actually worshipping demons and invoking demonic power. The New Testament argues this in 1 Corinthians 10, and in the world of Ice and Fire, worshippers of the Red God have a very similar view about other faiths. Yet, if there truly are malevolent, wicked, deceptive supernatural beings in the world, and their power and influence are so vast that they can inspire and direct entire schools of religious thought, how would you know that your God is not one of them? Just as you might believe that Stannis has been tricked or misled, how do you know that you have not been tricked or misled? As I mentioned before, I think fantasy and science fiction are powerful genres because they can help us examine and critique aspects of our own world through the lens of imaginary ones. I have become aware of the fact that there is a religious, particularly Christian, following of the show and the novels that I don't really think has ever looked at this particular comparison between Stannis and Abraham before. I, of course, am a bit surprised, as I mentioned, that the devoutly religious enjoy the books and TV shows, considering that they have fairly explicit sex and violence in them, much more than the beloved Tolkien or Lewis books. I mean, looking back at my own mindset as a Christian, I probably would not have enjoyed them, but hey, I'm an apostate, so take that for what you will. The point is that the series has provided us with a very real, visceral, powerful, gut-wrenching depiction of what someone being willing to kill their child as a human sacrifice because a god supposedly wants them to would actually look like. So the question is this. If you are a fan of the series who believes in the Bible or the Quran, do you condemn Stannis' willingness to sacrifice his child to the Red God? Do you condemn the actions of other followers of Lord of Light who are willing to perform human sacrifices? If you do, on what grounds do you condemn Stannis' act as evil, and then praise Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his child to please Yahweh? I suspect your arguments will seem like special pleading to someone like me, Well, those of you who don't just say that only theists have grounds for moral statements, because, this is an atheist versus theist debate, and somebody has to pull that out. But I am very curious. As always, answer the questions by questioning the answers. Later.